At my 40th wedding anniversary celebration, my own son suddenly stood up, looked straight at my wife and me, and said, "You have 24 hours to leave this house." He didn't shout in anger. He didn't pull me aside privately. He said it in front of all the guests, like it was completely normal. I turned my head toward my wife, who had only recently recovered from a serious illness, and I gave a small, calm smile, because in that exact moment, I understood something very clearly. He believed he had already won, but for me, it felt like I had finally closed a door that had been open far too long. Before I continue, I want to pause for a moment and say thank you for listening. Now let me take you back to that evening, to the point where everything started shifting in a way none of us could have predicted. That afternoon, the air around the estate felt heavier than usual, like the heat itself was pressing down on everything. I had attended many gatherings before, polite greetings, careful handshakes, soft laughter that didn't always mean anything. But that day felt different from the beginning. I stood holding a glass of wine, preparing to speak a few simple words about 40 years of marriage with my wife Margaret. I had thought about it carefully in advance because she had only just come out of a long illness, and I wanted the moment to be gentle and warm, nothing stressful. I hadn't even finished my first sentence when my son Brandon suddenly interrupted me. He didn't rush. He slowly pushed his chair back, straightened his jacket, and looked around the room as though he had been waiting for this exact moment his whole life. What struck me wasn't just his words, but the look in his eyes, as if something inside him had already made a final decision, and there was no turning back. He announced that the property was now under new control, and that Margaret and I had 24 hours to pack our belongings and leave. He spoke in a calm, businesslike tone, as if he was simply giving instructions for maintenance work. There was no hesitation in him at all. The entire room fell silent. Even the small sounds disappeared, the clinking of glasses, the air conditioner humming in the background. I felt Margaret's hand tighten around mine. Her hand felt thinner than it used to be, still warm but fragile. I could sense her confusion immediately, the confusion of someone who had always believed that family meant safety no matter what. Brandon raised a document in his hand. He said it proved legal authority over the property, signed by Margaret herself. I looked at the paper, and something inside me immediately recognized the truth. The signature on it was slightly uneven, shaky. It did not look like her usual handwriting. At that moment, a memory came back to me. Margaret had been in hospital, weak, drifting in and out of awareness. I had asked Brandon to help with a few basic papers, trusting him completely because he was our son. Next to him stood Tiffany. She didn't speak a single word. She only gave a small nod, avoiding eye contact with everyone she once knew through me. Her silence was more revealing than anything she could have said out loud. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to defend myself in front of everyone. I just looked at Margaret. Her expression was not angry or panicked. It was quiet sadness, like someone slowly realizing that something deeply precious had been taken away without noticing. I gave her a small, gentle smile. Then I turned to Brandon and actually congratulated him. There was no sarcasm in my voice. It sounded like a man who had been waiting a very long time for this moment to finally arrive. I told him that he no longer needed to hide what he truly wanted, that now, in front of everyone, he had finally said it out loud. I placed a small memory card on the table next to his glass. I didn't explain anything. I didn't threaten him. I only told him to watch it later, not during the party. Some truths are not meant to be opened in front of guests. Then I took Margaret's hand and we quietly left the room. Behind us, I could hear whispers beginning to rise, confusion spreading through people who had known us for years. I didn't look back even once. I had spent most of my life protecting the image of this family. That night, I no longer felt the need to protect it anymore. In my old study, where everything still smelled like wood and paper from years ago, Margaret sat down slowly. After a long silence, she asked me in a very soft voice if she had done something wrong. I immediately told her no. I said she had done nothing wrong at all. I told her the only mistake she ever made was believing that patience and silence would always be rewarded in the end. I didn't tell her everything that night. I didn't tell her I had already been watching things carefully for months, not because I was clever, but because life teaches you, over time, to hear what people are not saying out loud. 6 months earlier, I had overheard conversations no father should ever hear. I chose silence at the time, not because I was blind, but because I wanted to understand how far things would go before I intervened. That same night at the anniversary, Brandon and Tiffany came into my study as if everything had already been decided. They held the document confidently, as if one signature could erase decades of life and memories. They became irritated when they saw me calmly collecting old photographs from the shelves. I wasn't destroying them out of anger. I was simply preparing to let go of a chapter that had already ended in reality, even if others refused to see it. When the door closed behind them, the sounds of the celebration outside faded away completely. All I could hear was the ticking clock on the wall and my own breathing. Brandon believed that night was the start of his control. For me, it was only the point where everything I had been delaying finally came together. Months before that, Margaret had been at her weakest. She would forget things mid-sentence and sometimes lose track of days. I had allowed Brandon and Tiffany to help around the house, trusting them because I believed children would never cross certain boundaries. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than expected. I stopped near the kitchen when I heard their voices. They were not arguing. They were speaking calmly, almost clinically, as if they were discussing property rather than a human life. Tiffany suggested placing Margaret into a cheaper care facility. Brandon replied that everything would work out once the paperwork was handled correctly. They even talked about my belongings as if they were worthless assets waiting to be sold. I stood there without entering, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to hear the truth fully. Sometimes people only reveal themselves when they think no one is listening. That evening, I said nothing to Margaret. She was already exhausted and fragile. I didn't want to disturb her with doubts. Instead, I started paying attention quietly. I noticed Brandon asking more and more questions about finances, ownership, and accounts. He believed I was simply an old man living in the past. He didn't realize I still had deep involvement in financial matters, even if I no longer showed it openly. His business grew rapidly, faster than it should have. I had seen the numbers long before they became public. I had once supported him quietly, believing I was helping him build stability. But over time, I noticed money moving in strange directions, decisions that made no logical sense. Slowly, I understood something I didn't want to accept. Brandon was not just struggling with responsibility. He was also running from serious financial problems he could not fix. A friend later contacted me, carefully mentioning questionable investments and hidden debts. I checked everything myself. What I discovered made everything clear. The property was never just about inheritance or family. For him, it was an escape route. The signature from Margaret had not been a coincidence. It was part of a plan carefully prepared over time. They had chosen the moment when she was weakest and when I would be distracted. From that point on, I began gathering information quietly. I saved messages, records, and patterns of behavior, not out of anger, but because once trust is broken in that way, there is no return to innocence. The night before the anniversary, I sat alone in the study, looking at old photographs. I knew exactly what Brandon planned to do the next day, and I also knew I would not stop him immediately. When I placed the memory card on the table at the party, it was not a trap. It was the last opportunity for him to step back before everything became irreversible. But he didn't stop. In the study later that night, he stood in front of me, as if victory was already guaranteed. Tiffany stayed near the door, impatient and restless. They believed everything had already ended. I looked at them and finally said what they did not expect to hear. I told them this property had never truly been in either of our names. For the first time that night, Brandon froze completely, because in that moment he realized the story was not over at all. By refusing to help anymore, Margaret came in a little later. She was holding a small box in her hands. She slowly opened it and placed a watch on the table. It was the same watch Brandon had taken earlier and never spoke about again. She pushed it gently toward him and said she had bought it back using her own money, not as repayment, not to fix anything, but just to end a chapter that had been left open for too long. She looked at Brandon for a long time without blinking. Then she spoke in a calm voice. She said she had raised a man once, but the person standing in front of her now didn't feel like that same son anymore. She told him that from this day forward, she would no longer wait for promises that never came true. No more arguments, no more accusations, no more holding on to something that kept breaking her heart slowly over time. Brandon lowered his head and stayed silent. I cannot say what was going on in his mind at that moment, but I could clearly feel he had just lost something that no amount of money could ever bring back or replace. Something deeper than property or status. Something human that once gone does not return easily. Tiffany showed up not long after that. She didn't step inside the house. She stayed near the gate and called Brandon out. Their conversation didn't last long at all. It was short, almost cold. From where I was standing, I saw Tiffany hand him a stack of papers. I didn't need to ask what they were about. I already understood. When a ship begins to sink, the first instinct of many people is not to save it, but to find a way to leave it behind as quickly as possible. A few days later, I found out that Tiffany had decided to cooperate with the people reviewing Brandon's financial affairs. She chose her own safety first. I wasn't shocked by it. Life had already taught me that some people never see family as something to protect. For them, family is only useful until it stops serving their needs, and then it becomes something to abandon. Brandon's business fell apart faster than anyone expected. One by one, partners withdrew, agreements were canceled, projects that once looked promising were shut down without warning. There was no dramatic ending, no loud collapse, no single moment of explosion. It was quieter than that, just a slow disappearance, like doors closing one after another, without anyone bothering to hold them open. That night, I stood alone in the study and looked around the house for what felt like the last time. It no longer felt felt like a home full of life. It felt like a place that had finished telling its story. I did not feel proud or victorious. I only felt a strange emptiness, like waking up after a long dream and realizing it was never real in the first place. Margaret stood next to me quietly. She took my hand without saying anything. In that silence, I understood something very clearly. What truly mattered was not what Brandon had lost, but what we had managed to keep safe within ourselves. Our peace, our honesty, and the ability to walk away without letting bitterness follow us. After all the legal matters and emotional storms had settled, I realized I no longer had a reason to stay in that large estate. The house had seen too much silence, and silence that lasts too long slowly turns into weight that presses down on the heart. I didn't want the rest of my life tied to walls that only reminded me of disappointment and broken trust. Margaret felt the same way, even if she didn't express it in many words. One quiet morning, as sunlight gently spread across the old wooden porch, she rested her hand on the railing and said softly that she no longer felt this place was home. There was no anger in her voice, only acceptance, and that was enough. We made the decision to sell the estate, not because we were in need of money, but because we did not want it to become a monument to pain or regret. We wanted it to be released, not preserved as a reminder of bitterness. Most of the money from the sale was later donated to a local charity that supports families who take care of elderly loved ones for long periods of time. Margaret signed the final documents herself. Her hand no longer shook. Her signature was firm, steady, and clear, as if she had finally found balance again after a long storm. On the day we left Savannah, there was no celebration, no gathering, no long goodbyes. There were no friends standing around, no emotional speeches. Only 2 suitcases, a few old books, and the small things we truly needed. Before leaving, I turned the key in the lock one last time, then placed it in the agent's hand. After that, I walked away without stopping. I did not look back, not even once. We moved to a small wooden house near the coast of Oregon. There were no tall fences, no iron gates, no large driveway, just open air, ocean wind, the smell of salt in the breeze, and the endless rhythm of waves touching the shore again and again. On our first morning there, Margaret woke up before I did. I found her in the kitchen making coffee, opening the windows, letting natural light fill the room without resistance. I watched her quietly and realized how long it had been since I had seen her look this peaceful. Life slowed down after that. There were no tight schedules, no constant calls, no meetings that drained energy without purpose. I spent time fixing a small old boat I had bought from a neighbor. It wasn't anything special, just something simple to keep my hands busy. Margaret started planting flowers along the small porch outside our home. Row by row, she turned empty soil into something living again. Each small task seemed ordinary on its own, but together they built a life that finally felt calm. Sometimes I think about Brandon, not with anger anymore, and not with sadness either, just with distance, the way you remember a road you once traveled, knowing you will never walk it again. I've heard he now lives in a small apartment on the edge of town, doing temporary work, keeping himself away from the world he once tried to dominate. I do not ask for updates, and I do not chase information. I simply let whatever comes, come, and pass on its own. Margaret has never once said she hates her son. She only says she learned something important too late in life. That love alone is not enough when there are no boundaries, and forgiveness, if it ever truly arrives, cannot be forced. It has to come slowly, in its own time, or not at all. One afternoon, while we were walking along the shoreline, Margaret held my hand and asked me if I had any regrets. I stayed quiet for a long time before answering. Eventually, I told her that what stayed with me was not what had happened, but how long I had chosen silence before acting. I had believed that endurance would protect everything, especially family, but I've learned that silence, when used for too long, can also allow damage to grow without being seen. I told her something I had learned during my years working as an engineer. If a small crack in a structure is ignored, it does not remain small. It spreads quietly over time, not because someone wants destruction, but because no one stops long enough to repair it early. Families are no different from structures in that way. Margaret nodded slowly. She said she did not want to carry old resentment into whatever time she had left. She only wanted clarity now, to understand what should be held close and what should finally be released. That evening, we sat together on the porch and watched the sun slowly disappear into the ocean. I thought about the old watch, about past arguments, about photographs and documents that once seemed so important but now felt distant. I did not feel loss anymore. I felt lighter, as if something heavy had finally been put down after being carried for too long. Some legacies are not written in wills or stored in banks. They exist in how a person chooses to leave pain behind without turning it into hatred. If there is anything I want to say to anyone hearing this story, it is this: do not confuse silence with weakness. Many times people stay silent because they love their children deeply, but there comes a moment when silence stops protecting and starts destroying. At that point, you must choose action, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect and truth. Money can rebuild houses, but it cannot rebuild dignity once it has been ignored or broken. And family, if it is not built on respect, eventually becomes only a word without meaning. The ocean breeze moved gently that evening. Margaret rested her head lightly on my shoulder. I held her hand and did not let go. In front of us, there were no big plans waiting, no grand expectations, only simple days that would continue one after another at their own pace. And after everything we had been through, that simple, quiet life was exactly what we had been searching for without even realizing it. If you have stayed with this story until the end, I appreciate your time. If it made you think or reminded you of your own family in some way, feel free to like, subscribe, and share it so these kinds of stories can reach more people. Your support helps keep these stories alive, shared honestly and slowly, one at a time. Thank you for being here until the very end.